Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Mary Cooloff, the President of the Royal Society of Tasmania, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to this webinar presented by the Royal Society. We're very pleased to have so many members and supporters joining us from Tasmania, from interstate, and from overseas. And it's a particular honour today to have our patron with us, the Governor of Tasmania, Professor the Honourable Kate Warner. In beginning this webinar, I'd like to pay respects to the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet today, the Muwinina people, to pay respects to those who have passed before us, and to pay respects to Tasmania's Aboriginal community, who are the custodians of this land. A couple of points about today's webinar. Your chat facility is disabled, and you'll be able to ask questions at the end of the lecture using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And this lecture is being recorded. Our speaker today is Dr. Ed Doddridge. Ed was a member of the Royal Society since his undergraduate days at the University of Tasmania, where he studied science, graduated with first-class honours, and won many academic prizes, including the University of Tasmania Medal. He then went on to win a Rhodes Scholarship to study physical oceanography at the University of Oxford in England. After gaining his doctorate, he took up a position as postdoctoral research associate at MIT in Boston and has now returned to Tasmania to work at the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies in Hobart, part of UTAS, where Ed is also a theme leader in the Australian Antarctic Program Partnership. Ed's research uses theory, numerical models and observation to study the Southern Ocean, the circulation of the ocean, the dynamics of the ocean, and its role in our climate system. He's published scientific research papers in many highly respected journals, and a key focus is understanding the effect of the Southern Ocean on our climate. Ed's topic today is Going with the Wind, our changing Southern Ocean. So it was with great pleasure, Ed, that I hand the screen over to you.
Thank you very much, Mary, for that wonderful introduction and also for the invitation to speak with the Royal Society of Tasmania today. Now, as you mentioned, the research that I'll be presenting today is looking at the Southern Ocean, and in particular how the Southern Ocean has been changing over the recent decades and how we think it might continue to change in the future. Now, this is research that I've done in collaboration with a number of people, and you can see their names listed on the screen here. So John, Hajun, Jean-Michel, Maxwell, and Larissa have all contributed to this. We received funding from the US National Science Foundation Polar Program, and I'm currently employed through the Australian Antarctic Program Partnership at IMAS, at UTAS. Now, before diving into how the Southern Ocean is changing and how it may continue to change, I think it's important that we all understand what I mean when I say the words Southern Ocean. So this is an animation of sea ice concentration and sea surface temperature in the Southern Hemisphere. And when I say Southern Ocean, I mean all of the waters around Antarctica. So everything from about 40 degrees south to the coast of Antarctica. So this is the water that is south of Australia, south of Africa, and south of South America. It joins up with the Southern Indian Ocean, the South Pacific, and the South Atlantic. Now in this animation, you can see the sea ice concentration increasing and decreasing every year. We call this the annual cycle or the seasonal cycle. Now the amount of sea ice that grows and then melts every year in the Southern Ocean is about the size of mainland Australia. This is an enormous area of ocean that is covered by ice and then uncovered every year. And that has very significant consequences for the ocean underneath. And if we look at the vertical structure of the temperature in the Southern Ocean, you can see that here. So now we've tilted our view, we're looking across at the Antarctica, and I've sliced through the ocean along two lines of longitude. And so at the surface, you can see that the waters near Antarctica are cold. These are almost -2 degrees Celsius. Now you might be thinking, hang on a sec, Water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius, that's how it's defined. But seawater is slightly different. Because it has salt in it, it doesn't freeze until it gets to about -2, which is how we can have water so cold. The other unusual thing about the Southern Ocean is that we end up with warm water underneath cold water at the surface. Now this can happen because of the salinity, the salt in the water. So the water that is deeper down is saltier. So although it's warmer, it's still denser and it sits below this water. Now, I'll just move my mouse across to highlight these regions. But if you look on the right, you can see this area down here of what I'll refer to as warm water. And it's important to remember that in this context, warm doesn't mean balmy. You still wouldn't want to swim in it. We're only talking about 3 or 4 degrees Celsius. So it's about the temperature of your fridge. Think of the water that comes out of the fridge and you pour it in a nice cold glass and have an icy glass of water. That's the sort of temperature that I'm going to call warm. But it is much warmer than the water above it, which is almost -2 degrees Celsius. Now, this unusual thermal structure in the Southern Ocean is going to be crucial for what I'm talking about later today. And we'll be thinking about how this heat that is down in the deep Southern Ocean may come up to the surface and how that can affect sea ice and the temperature at the surface of the ocean. The other thing that it's important to remember about the Southern Ocean is that it connects all of the other oceans. So when we form sea ice at the top of the Southern Ocean, we have very dense, cold, salty water that falls out of that sea ice. We call that brine rejection. So this cold, salty brine sinks down to the bottom of the ocean and then spreads north and fills up the deep oceans in the rest of the ocean basins. And if we look at a schematic of this circulation, you can see here the blue arrows moving north into the Indian and the Pacific Oceans. That's where this deep, cold, salty water moves as it moves away from Antarctica. The red lines on this graph represent the surface currents. So we have surface water moving northwards in the Atlantic and southwards through the Indian and the Pacific. You'll also notice that we have both a blue and a red line going around Antarctica at the bottom of this figure. So this is why the Southern Ocean is so important for oceanographers. It connects all of the other ocean basins. And as I change into this next figure, you can see that even more clearly. So again here, we have the red currents at the surface of the ocean, and the blue currents are down at depth in the deep ocean. But what this picture makes abundantly clear is that the Southern Ocean lies at the center of the global ocean. Now, you might be trying to wrap your head around how this map was created. And normally when we make 2D maps of the world, we cut through the oceans to make a flat representation of the globe. But for this one, we've cut through the continents. So we've sliced South America up the middle and we've cut between Europe and Asia and laid it all out. And this keeps the ocean as one contiguous whole, which is what it is in reality. And so here you can see that the Pacific connects to the Southern Ocean and the Indian Ocean connects to the Southern Ocean, as does the Atlantic. So those lines going around Antarctica really are the center of the global ocean. And if you take nothing else away from today, I want you to remember this image and remember that the Southern Ocean is at the center of the global ocean, because that's a really important point for oceanographers. Now, humans have been exploring the Southern Ocean for many hundreds of years. The first documented voluntary crossing of the Antarctic Circle was by James Cook in 1773. Now, the Antarctic Circle is essentially the same as the Arctic Circle. It's the latitude at which you have 24 hours of sunlight in the summer and 24 hours of darkness in the winter. So it's a long way south. It's about 66.5 degrees south. Now, it's possible that someone crossed this line before Cook, but if they did, they didn't make it back to tell everyone about it. And during his voyage of exploration in the South Pacific, Cook eventually went to 71 degrees, 10 minutes south. And the figure on the right is a map that he produced in 1777 when he got back to England and he wrote his book about his adventures and published it. Now, if we zoom in on a section of this map, And the section we've zoomed in on is over the South Pole. You can see South America, the very tip of it down here in the bottom right. And his path starts up here in the top left, and comes down, goes north a little bit, and then he comes south and dips below the Antarctic Circle. So this was the first time that humans had ever made it so far south. The little comment that he has written on the map here to describe what they saw is islands of ice innumerable, which is a fabulous alliteration and also a terrifying concept. To imagine that you're over a year's sail away from home, you're on a small wooden vessel and you're surrounded by islands of ice innumerable. So they made a fairly sensible decision, I think, and they went further north to see if they could find the great southern land further to the north. They couldn't, they sailed around and came back south to see how far south they could get, crossing the Antarctic Circle and eventually, as I said, getting to 71 degrees, 10 minutes south. The comment that he has written here is firm fields and vast mountains of ice, which is perhaps even more terrifying than the innumerable islands they saw before. Now, if we believe Cook's positions, and he was an excellent navigator, so it seems likely that they're quite accurate, he was probably within about 240 kilometers of the coast of Antarctica, which is incredibly close, but he still didn't see it. Anyway, having found as much ice as they were willing to see, they turned north and went home, and the rest of their voyage is chronicled in the histories. Now, I'm going to skip a few centuries, or about a century and a half, and talk about the adventures of Amundsen and the Fram. Now, the Fram was a purpose-built polar exploration vessel. So it had extremely thick and strong wooden hulls, and it was designed to pop out of the sea ice rather than be crushed. So it had originally been built for an expedition to the North Pole. Having done very well there, Amundsen decided to use it for his voyage to the South Pole. And this expedition to the South Pole is a stunning example of a well-planned and well-executed expedition. He wrote before he left, as you can see on the left, this quote, "I worked out the plan. Thus, we shall be back from the polar journey on January 25. And then indeed, it was on January 25th, 1912, that they sailed back into Framheim, having successfully reached the South Pole. It was a stunning expedition and incredibly impressive. Now, the Fram is an amazing vessel, and it simultaneously held records for the furthest north and furthest south that any vessel had been at that point in history. And if you visit Oslo in Norway, you can actually see the Fram. And a few years ago, I was lucky enough to go there. And when you visit the museum, they let you climb onto the boat and you can walk around and you can see the cabins that they slept in and where they ate and where they kept all of their equipment. So this is a little tourist photo of me on board the Fram, imagining that I'm a polar explorer, though as you can see by the clothes, it was not quite as cold as it is in the Southern Ocean. So that's a little history of human exploration of the Southern Ocean. But in the modern era, the way we collect data from the Southern Ocean is slightly different. We still use ships, but we also have satellites and robots that we send out into the ocean, as well as making use of our furry friends down in the south. Now, let's look in a bit more detail at each of these various ways of collecting data. Now, this movie was filmed on board the UK research vessel, the James Clark Ross, in the Southern Ocean. The two beams of light that you can see forming a V are spotlights on the vessel shining forward. And the reason that you can see them is because of the rain and the spray that is flying through the air. I'm just going to leave this video to play for a moment as you absorb the sheer ferocity of the conditions in the Southern Ocean. Now, as you're watching this, it's important to remember that this is not a small vessel. This is a large research vessel, a modern ship designed to handle these conditions. And indeed, it can, as you can see. They were able to take this footage and survive and perfectly unscathed. But I think it really highlights how dedicated the scientists are who go to sea on these boats, particularly when you remember that these research cruises can last 6 weeks or more. Now, they're not in conditions like this for the whole 6 weeks, but it's almost certain that you will experience something like this during that time. But even when the conditions aren't this severe, they can still be quite tough. So this is some footage and some photos from a different expedition into the Southern Ocean. And on the left, you can see the aft deck. So that's the rear section of the boat where people work when they're able to. At the moment, it's currently awash with waves, so nobody would be allowed out there to do any work. But on the right, you can see some scientists recovering what we call a rosette. So this is a collection of bottles that get lowered on a wire rope down into the ocean, and they collect samples of seawater from different depths. And these people are out on the deck dealing with this rosette, and it's currently snowing on them. So it's night, it's snowing, which gives you an indication of how cold it is. So I just wanted to show you this footage to give you an idea of the true dedication of these scientists who go and collect this data for us. And it is incredibly valuable and extremely important. One of the other ways that we get information about what is happening in the ocean and the atmosphere is through satellites. Now, satellites have been revolutionary. Because they fly above the Earth's surface, they look down, and we can cover the entire Earth with these satellite data sets. And they can tell us about the temperature at the top of the ocean. They can also tell us about the surface elevation of the ocean. Now, because of the fact that the Earth is rotating, the tilt, the large scale tilt of the surface of the ocean actually tells us about the ocean currents underneath. So that's an incredibly valuable data set that tells us about the currents and the dynamics going on. These satellites can also measure surface winds by looking at how rough the surface of the ocean is. They can tell us how much sea ice there is, and that animation that I showed you at the start used satellite data of sea ice concentration to make the animation. These satellites can also tell us about clouds and the different gases that make up the atmospheric composition. So these are incredibly rich global data sets, but unfortunately as an oceanographer, they only tell us about the top of the ocean. From up in space, you can't see down into the ocean interior, which is why we still need to go out on ships and we need to send other things into the ocean to explore it for us. Now, one of the most revolutionary tools that we have is called an Argo float. So this is an autonomous ocean robot that drifts around, and every 10 days or so, it sinks to about 2 kilometers depth and then floats back up to the surface. And as it comes up to the surface, it's recording how salty the water is and how warm the water is the whole way. When it reaches the surface of the ocean, it sends that data off to satellites, which bounce it back to us on land. And we get an almost real-time measurement of what the ocean is doing. So that's one Argo float, but we don't just have one. We have an armada of about 4,000 of these floats covering the global ocean. And so since this program started in the mid-2000s, we've had an almost real-time data feed of what the ocean is like, up to, from the surface all the way down to 2 kilometers depth. Now that's not the entire ocean because the deepest parts are more than 10 kilometers deep, but it is an incredible data set that is giving us enormous insights into how the ocean has been changing over the last 15 years. The other tool that we have that is particularly useful near the poles is we enlist support from seals. So you can see on the right here, 2 seals, one that has a very fancy hat and the other who's very jealous of their friend with the fancy hat. So these hats are attached to the seals and they measure how salty the water is and how warm the water is. And every time the seal comes up to breathe, it sends those measurements off to satellites, much like the Argo floats. On the left, you can see a map of all the measurements that we have from these seals. And they've taken about 500,000 profiles for us across the Southern Ocean, which is a phenomenally useful data set. So that's how we measure what's happening in the Southern Ocean. And before I get into how the Southern Ocean has been changing, I want to look a little bit at the global context. So this is a measurement of the carbon dioxide concentration from the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. This is a record going back to 1958, and it's the longest continuous record of atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration that we have. The little zigzags that you can see on the line are the annual cycle. So every year as the forests breathe in and out, you can see the carbon dioxide going up and down just a little bit. But superimposed on that annual cycle is a fairly alarming increase. So the pre-industrial concentration was about 280 parts per million. And I was born when the concentration was 344. Today, it's 416. This is a huge change that we're imposing on the global climate system, and particularly when we consider the long-term context. So we can use ice core data. This is where scientists have gone into the polar regions and they've drilled out tubes of ice and then measured the atmospheric gases trapped in that ice. And that gives us a record of atmospheric CO2 concentration going back thousands and thousands of years. And you can see that for the last 10,000 years, it was pretty constant. And then the Industrial Revolution came along, and all of a sudden it increased dramatically. And the big impact that is having on the global climate system is that it's changing the mean temperature. So this is a figure from a UK climate scientist called Ed Hawkins, and each vertical line represents 1 year, and the color represents the temperature anomaly in that year. When I say anomaly, I mean the difference between the temperature that year and the average temperature over some time period. So in this figure, the blues are cold and the reds are warm, and the deeper the blue or the red, the more extreme the anomaly. On the left, we start at 1901, and on the right, we finish at 2019. So you can see that there's been a very clear shift from mostly blues to almost exclusively reds. So having gone through that global context, let's look at the Southern Ocean. And the big question of this talk is, what is happening in the Southern Ocean and what's going to continue happening to the Southern Ocean? One of the most noticeable trends that we have seen in the Southern Ocean is that it has become windier. On the left, you can see several lines, but the one that I want you to focus on is the red line. So that bounces around, but overall it goes from the bottom left up to the middle right of that figure. And the dashed red line, that is a straight line behind that wiggly one, shows the trend over this period. And so this line is measuring how windy it is in the Southern Ocean. So you can see that it's become substantially windier over the last few decades. And on the right, you can see a map of that change in how windy it is. So everywhere that it's red, the wind has been getting stronger, and the few places where it's blue, it hasn't been getting stronger, it's been getting weaker. But overall, we've seen a marked increase in this wind over the Southern Ocean. It's also worth noting that a lot of this increase has happened in the summertime. So there has been an increase in winds, in how windy it is throughout the year, but most of the increase has happened in the summer. So now that we know it has been getting windier in the Southern Ocean, especially over the summertime, what has happened to the Southern Ocean as the summertime winds have strengthened? And now let's turn to some observations. And so here we're going to look at the ocean temperature. So on the left is a plot of the surface temperature of the ocean. So this is the temperature right up at the top where the ocean and the atmosphere meet. Now, in the context of a world that's been getting warmer, markedly warmer, you might expect the Southern Ocean to also be getting warmer, but it hasn't. And this counterintuitive result is one of the things that I and my colleagues are working to try and understand. So on that figure on the left, everywhere that it's blue means it's been getting colder over the last 30 years, from 1982 through to 2011. Everywhere it's been red, it's been getting warmer. So vast areas of the Southern Ocean have been getting colder, at least at the surface. And the figure on the right shows the vertical structure of this temperature change. So the vertical axis here is depth. So as we go down this axis, we're going deeper and deeper into the ocean. So we get to about 2,000 meters at the bottom of this graph. Antarctica is on the left, and is on the right, sorry. And as we go to the left, we're moving further north. So Tasmania would sit about here. The other thing that has happened with this graph is that we're looking at an average around the world. So we've averaged along lines of constant latitude to make this two-dimensional figure. And what you can see is that at the surface, it has been cooling, just as we saw on that figure on the left. But below the surface, it's been getting warmer. Now, if you cast your minds back to that slide I showed many slides ago, where we had cold water at the surface and warm water below that, this means that the cold at the top has been getting colder and the warm has been getting warmer. So it's not particularly intuitive how this could be happening. My colleagues and I have a number of different theories about what could be happening. And that's where I want to take you through in the latter part of this talk, some of those ideas and how we're trying to test those theories. The other remarkable change that we have seen in the Southern Ocean relates to the sea ice. So now I'm plotting the amount of sea ice in November. So this is, we measure the ice in November with our satellites, and then if it's the same as the average amount we have seen in all of the Novembers, it would be 0 on this graph. And if we have more ice than usual, it's a positive number. If we have less ice than usual, it's a negative number. Now, what you'll notice in this graph is that as time is progressing from left to right, it's primarily getting more positive. So we're getting more ice on average. So from 1979 all the way through to 2015, we were seeing this slow increase in sea ice around Antarctica. I've picked the November value here because it makes a very pretty plot, but this holds across the annual cycle. But in 2016, something remarkable happened. This happened. Now I want you to consider for a moment just how unexpected this was. We've been watching a slow increase in sea ice extent around Antarctica, which, to be fair, was quite puzzling. The world has been getting warmer. Why should there be more ice around Antarctica? And then in 2016, suddenly it crashed. We just lost a vast quantity of sea ice. And in the years since then, we've seen a slight recovery, but it hasn't come back to where it used to be. Now, this is quite perplexing, I think. At least it was to me, and I hope you find it perplexing as well. So having looked at all of these trends that we have seen, these changes that have happened over the previous decades in the Southern Ocean, the question that I want to pose to you is, how can we understand these changes? We've seen that the surface temperature of the ocean has been getting colder. We've seen that it's been getting warmer at depth underneath in the Southern Ocean. We also saw that it was getting icier. We were getting more and more sea ice until all of a sudden a large portion of it vanished. So what I want to do now is to start looking at some of the research that I've been doing with my colleagues to think about how we can understand these changes and how we might try and predict what happens in the future. And to do that, I'm going to think about 3 distinct timescales. We're going to think about the very short-term response. So what happens when it's windier in the summer? What does that do to the ocean underneath? And then we're going to think about the seasonal timescale, months to a year. What happens over the following year? So we have a windier summer, which is what we've been seeing consistently across the last few decades. And what then happens to the ocean over the following year? So we hit it in the summertime with these extra winds. And then what does it do? And then I want to think about the long-term response over the following years to decades to centuries, and how the ocean and the sea ice evolve together to respond to this change in the atmosphere. Now, you'll see that I've made some little notes underneath each of these timescales. Over the short term, what we see is that the atmosphere dominates. So we have a change in the atmosphere and the ocean just responds to that change. And so this is very much an atmospheric driven response in the short term. In the seasonal timescale, over months to a year, we see an interplay between the ocean and the atmosphere. So the atmosphere changes, and then the ocean is responding to this change, and they're both working together and adjusting to produce what happens over the following year. And then over the very long term, years to decades to centuries, we'll see that the ocean dynamics play the most important role. Now, you might just think that as an oceanographer, I'm trying to say that the ocean is the most important thing in the long-term response. But hopefully by the end of this, you'll believe me and you'll agree. Now, as we dive into these different timescales and these mechanisms, I want to remind you and refresh your memory about the temperature structure of the Southern Ocean. So you'll remember that we had this cold water at the surface, and as we go down, it gets warmer. So in the upper 300 meters, and this little black line here represents 300 meters depth. I've expanded the upper 300 so that we can see this more clearly. As we go down, it's getting warmer. Now this is the annual average, or the long-term average temperature structure, but it also has very important seasonal variations. And so if we look at the average temperature in February, rather than the annual, the long-term average, you can see that it gets even more complicated. So we have this layer of warm water at the surface, and I'll just highlight that with a couple of these blue ellipses. So now, as we go down through the ocean, it's warm at the surface, and remember, warm is very relative here. We're only talking 6, maybe 8 degrees Celsius on a very warm day. We go through that layer of warm water, it gets cold below it, and then it starts getting warm again. And then as we go down into the deep ocean, it starts getting colder again. Now this layer of warm water at the surface is what we call the mixed layer. So this is a layer of water right at the top of the ocean where it's mixing very thoroughly and it's in contact with the atmosphere. So this is the part of the ocean that the atmosphere affects most directly and most quickly. So with that in mind, let's look at what happens when the summertime wind gets stronger. So this is the average February temperature structure. Remember, it's warmer at the surface, and then about 50 meters below that, it's a bit colder. And then for the next couple of hundred, it starts getting a little bit warmer again. But focus on the upper 50 meters. So it's cold, it's warm water above cold water. And when it gets windier, we see that the surface ocean actually gets colder. And we can understand this through a number of different mechanisms, but the one that I and my colleagues think is most likely is that the extra wind mixes that surface of the ocean. So here, this little tor prime, that's what we use to represent the wind. So it's anomalously windy, it's windier than usual. And that causes extra mixing. These white squiggly arrows represent mixing. And the black line represents the change from the warm water to the cold water. So if we're mixing the warm water at the surface with the cold water below it, and then we look at the difference in temperature from what we expected, we find that the ocean has become anomalously warm down here. So that's the warmth from the surface that has been drawn down about 50 meters below the surface. We also see that the very top of the ocean has become anomalously cold, and that's what we saw in this map. So we have this large ring of cooling all around Antarctica. And this is the vertical structure that we think explains that cooling. So that's the very fast response, the weeks to months. And then the seasonal response, we think of that as an interplay between the ocean and the atmosphere. So as the seasons progress and we move from summer into autumn, the atmosphere actually puts more heat into the surface ocean. And this happens because the atmosphere and the ocean are in balance normally. And so when we make the surface of the ocean colder than usual, it actually pulls heat out of the atmosphere into the upper ocean. So the ocean is getting this extra heat, which we call Q prime, if you want to be technical about it. But this extra heat comes down into the ocean and warms it up. So now we have all of this extra heat at depth that we mixed down from the surface ocean, and then we've pulled more heat into the very top of the ocean to get rid of this cold anomaly. And so as winter progresses, we mix both of these together, mix this warmth at depth and this slight cooling at the surface, and we end up with a slight warming throughout the upper 100 meters or so. Now, this mechanism, you might expect that we have more ice in the autumn as we're growing ice over this water that is colder than usual. But then by the time we get to winter, perhaps we have less ice because now the ocean is a bit warmer than it should normally be. So this is our mechanism, and this is what we wanted to test. This was our hypothesis. This is the process that we think is driving the seasonal response of the ocean. So what we did is we turned to observations, and this figure comes from a data set derived from the Argo floats. You remember those autonomous ocean robots that drift around? We have about 4,000 of them in the ocean, sending back data every 10 days. So if we use that data set from the Argo floats, and then we look at the temperature difference in February due to these anomalous summertime winds, we see a vertical structure very much like this mechanism that I had just proposed. So what we see is we see cooling at the surface, and then we see warming just below that at about 100 meters depth. And this black line represents the demarcation between the warmer, very top layers and the colder water below that. So this looks exactly like what we would predict from our mechanism. And because it comes from observations, we don't have to worry about whether our models were wrong. This is very good evidence that our idea might be correct. We've also tested this in some numerical simulations. The advantage of using numerical models is that we can diagnose everything very precisely. And so we can show that it is in fact extra mixing that causes this change. Now, in those models, we can also measure how much sea ice we have. And so this is a graph of the change in sea ice volume through the year. So we have those summertime winds, December, January, February. And then we see a slight increase in the volume of sea ice. So this means that we're freezing more seawater into ice and it's floating on top of the ocean. And because the ocean was cold, we can do that more easily. But then, as winter progresses, this goes back across zero and becomes negative. So this is what we expected to see in the final phase of our mechanism. That heat that we pushed down into the ocean comes back up in the wintertime and actually reduces how much ice we have. Now, this analysis comes from a numerical model from the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Science coupled climate model. And the reason that we had to use a model for this rather than observations is that we don't have very good observations of how thick sea ice is. The satellites are incredible and they can tell you where the ice is, but measuring how thick that ice is really difficult. So we had to use a numerical model. So now we've thought about the short-term response, weeks to months, the seasonal response, months to a year or so. Let's think about what might happen in the long term. Now, this is a hypothesis put forward by David Ferreira and others back in 2015. And there's a lot going on in this figure, but what I want you to look at, to take away from it, is that they predicted as the wind got stronger that we would upwell through here. So we would bring this warm water up to the surface. And now this warm water is the stuff that's about 300 meters down. And as the wind changes, they expected that to pull this warm water up. And to plot that on a figure that you're already familiar with. So this is the warm water at depth, about 300 meters down. And this blue arrow represents how they expected it to come up through the ocean towards the surface. Now, obviously, if we bring water that's about 4 degrees Celsius up to the surface, that's going to melt sea ice, or at the very least, stop sea ice from growing. So this is a really important problem to solve, because the sea ice is tremendously important for the ocean and for the ecosystem and all of the biology that lives there. So what we did, because it's very difficult to measure this sort of upwelling in the actual ocean, we ran a numerical simulation. And what we did was we changed the winds, and we then predicted what should happen from their mechanism. And the dashed red line here represents how much warmer it should be getting in the subsurface ocean. So that would be the ocean about here, at the head of this arrow, right here. The red line tells us how much warmer that should be getting through time. And then, as we ran the model, we could measure what happened. And the green line is what happened. So you can see for the first couple of years, it was indeed getting warmer, just like they predicted. Not quite at the same rate that they predicted, but very close. But then after a couple of years, something happened. Something changed, and the hypothesis was no longer correct. And if we look at what happened to the sea surface temperature, this is the orange line. You can see that it gets colder, and then it just sort of bounces around. So it stayed colder than it was. So the summertime winds got stronger, we had the cooling, just like we've seen in the real Southern Ocean, but we didn't get any warming that they predicted over the long term. The reason that we didn't get this warming is because the ocean responded to that change and actually stopped that water from coming up. So the black line here represents this anomalous, we call it upwelling. That's where water upwells, it comes up towards the surface of the ocean. And you can see that for the first few years, we had some upwelling, but then the ocean changed and that went back towards zero. So this anomalous upwelling disappeared because of the ocean dynamics. Now, this is a bit of a caveat for this result, is that it comes from a numerical model. So it's not the real Southern Ocean, but it represents all of the processes that we think are really important here. And the fact that we haven't seen warming at the surface of the Southern Ocean suggests that this is probably what's actually happened, that the wind has been changing, but the ocean has responded to that change in such a way that it's kept the warm water down at 300 meters depth. Now, what will happen next? Certainly trying to understand the ocean dynamics is something that I and my colleagues will continue working on so that we can better predict how they will change in the future. But one of the big uncertainties that we face with any of these climate change projections or predictions is trying to understand what's going to happen to the global context. Now, you remember we had that beautiful figure from Ed Hawkins. This is a variation of it by Professor Neroli Abram from the ANU. And here, once again, every vertical stripe represents 1 year of temperature. And again, the blues are cold. And as we go through the oranges to the red, it's getting warmer. And then on the top right, you can see we run out of reds. And so we go into purples, through the dark purples into black. And the black represents 5 or 6 degrees warming. Now, the two pathways on the right-hand side show two of the climate change projections that the IPCC has used to test what might happen in the future. The top one is a high emissions pathway. So if we continue to produce vast quantities of CO2 and other greenhouse gases, that's the sort of global context that we'll be in. If instead we swap to a low emissions pathway, the bottom right-hand corner, things won't get very much warmer than they are now. They'll still get a bit warmer, but nothing like that high emissions pathway. So our job of trying to understand how the Southern Ocean will respond in the future and how it will change depends enormously on the global context of climate change that we see the Southern Ocean within. And one of the reasons why trying to predict what happens in the Southern Ocean is so important is that all of the ice sheets on Antarctica represent an enormous potential contribution to sea level rise. So these two lines here represent those same two scenarios that we saw on the right-hand side of the previous figure. The red one is the high emissions pathway. And by 2100, that gives us almost a meter of sea level rise. But by the time we get out to 2300, that's 4, maybe 5 meters of sea level rise. But the low emissions pathway is much lower. And it's hard to see them diverge until substantially into the future. But by the time you get to 2100, the low emissions pathway has less than half a metre and doesn't even quite get to a metre by 2300. The pathway that we follow is very much up to us. And while my colleagues and I will work to try and understand how the Southern Ocean will change, the decisions that we all make about which pathway we want to follow make that job, well, not more difficult, but they change the sort of world that we're working within. So that brings me to my conclusions. So the Southern Ocean is changing, and it's changing in quite strange ways. We've seen that the surface has been cooling, but that the deep Southern Ocean has been warming. And trying to understand the mechanisms causing this cooling is a very hot research topic at the moment. So we've seen that the summertime winds cause a change in the sea ice growth. We get more sea ice through the autumn, and then we get less sea ice in the winter, probably, remembering that that result came from a numerical model. So treat it with just a hint of skepticism. We've also seen that understanding the ocean dynamics is absolutely crucial for predicting the long-term response of the Southern Ocean climate system. But more importantly, our behaviour shapes what sort of future we end up in. And so while we can work to understand how the Southern Ocean will respond, the global context that that response is in is going to have an enormous impact. So thank you very much for your attention, for taking time out of your Sunday afternoon to come and listen, and I hope you have lots of questions.
Ed, thank you very much for that fascinating talk. I want you all to imagine that you're in the Royal Society meeting room at the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery in Hobart, and I would be very happy now to receive questions from the audience, except instead of putting up your hand, please type your question in using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. For people who have just joined us, I'm Mary Cooloff, the President of the Royal Society, and we're very happy that so many participants were able to join us today for this lecture. So we have a question. Ed, are the Argo buoys moored? They seem to be very evenly distributed around the oceans.
Oh, that's a great question. Now, the Argo floats drift within the ocean. So one of the reasons that they're fairly well distributed is that a lot of clever people put a lot of time and effort into making sure that they are well distributed. So when you go out on your research vessel and you put a new Argo float into the ocean, you often target a particular area. So they will put it in a place where there aren't as many as they would like. So although they drift freely, we do have this very nice coverage because of that.
Okay, thank you. We have a question now about sea ice volume compared with sea ice area. Thanks, Ed, for a great talk. Your model showed a decrease in sea ice volume in autumn and summer, but did it show an increase in sea ice area for those seasons, as has been observed?
That's a great question. I imagine this must have come from one of the oceanographers or ice experts who've been watching. It showed a non-significant change in sea ice area. So although there was a very slight increase, it was not statistically discernible from zero. So I couldn't say that it actually showed a change. Now, the fact that this is very slightly inconsistent with the observations is one of the things that we need to dig into to try and understand. And that's why using numerical models is both very powerful and somewhat fraught, because we need to balance the extra information that we get from the models, but also make sure that they are in line with reality. So thank you for the question.
Thank you. We have another question about models. How are models able to predict the likely future changes in overall ocean circulation currents?
So the sorts of models that we use for this actually solve dynamical equations that model fluid flow. So they're solving fluid dynamics problems for the ocean. And because we're trying to use them for such a large thing, because the ocean is quite big, there are various approximations and simplifications we have to make. But the way that the models can predict future changes is by solving conservation of energy, conservation of momentum, volume, things like this. So we're essentially using fundamental laws of physics to march forward these computer simulations. And that's how they work.
Thank you, Ed. Another question: how independent is something like the El Nino of the Southern Ocean conditions?
So El Nino and the Southern Ocean, the Southern Oscillation, are not my primary area, but I can have I can give some information to this. So El Nino is a tropical phenomenon, and we see that impacting the Southern Ocean. So we see the tropical dynamics propagating down towards Antarctica. What we don't tend to see is the conditions in Antarctica propagating north in the atmosphere to affect the tropics. So El Nino affects the Southern Ocean to some extent. You know, it's sort of, it affects it a little bit, but we don't see that immediate feedback going north. The way the Southern Ocean affects the rest of the world tends to be much slower through the ocean rather than the atmosphere. So it's not completely independent. There's a little bit of toing and froing between them.
Thank you, Ed. Another question about the warming of the oceans: is there anything to be learned from the warming of the oceans after the last ice age in sediment and ice core records? And do previous ice age records contribute to your numerical models?
Oh, absolutely. There is so much to be learned from looking at ice core and other sediment type data sets for looking at the ocean for last glacial maximum. I tend to focus on the more recent oceanographic changes that we've seen. So 20th century is where my research is focused. But through the sediment cores, we can get proxies. So a proxy is where we measure one thing and then we infer something else from it. So, you know, imagine you're at home and your partner comes home and they look really grumpy and you infer that they've had a bad day. That's a proxy type measurement. So through these sediment cores, we get proxies for what the ocean conditions were like. And that gives us things like the temperature or how salty it was. And we use that information to try and reconstruct the ocean circulation. So there is lots to be learned from how that changed from the last glacial maximum through to today, because that tells us how the real ocean responds to vast changes in climate. Now, those records don't directly contribute to the numerical models that I use, but they do contribute towards testing of numerical models. So if you run a model designed to mimic the last glacial maximum, you can compare it against those observations. And that tells you the sorts of things that the model does really well or that it doesn't do very well. And then you can work to fix the things that it doesn't do very well.
Okay, thank you, Ed. And I'd like to thank the participants for sending in so many great questions. There are a lot of questions on the screen. I'll just choose 2 or 3 final questions. Question about sea ice. Does the changing level of sea ice have an impact on how much solar heat is reflected or absorbed by the ocean?
Absolutely, it certainly does. There's a phenomenon called the ice albedo feedback. And the way this works is that when you grow a little bit of sea ice, that ice is very reflective and it's much lighter. So it's very white, whereas the ocean is relatively dark. So that white ice reflects light back out into space, and then the ocean gets colder because the heat got reflected away. So you grow a little bit of ice, it gets a bit colder, you grow a bit more ice, you grow a bit more ice, it gets a bit colder. So this is a positive feedback that we think is very important in certain stages of the Earth's history. So the changing sea ice has a huge impact on how the ocean responds to the sunlight coming in. And the opposite of that process that I just described, we think is quite important in the Arctic. So as we've lost more sea ice in the Arctic, more sunlight has been absorbed into the upper ocean, which has been warming, and then contributing to less sea ice growth.
Thank you, Ed. And our final question: could there be a tilting point that may initiate rapid upwelling and mixing in the Southern Ocean, or is the Southern Ocean getting more stably stratified?
I'm I'm not sure we're well placed to answer that. Tipping points are quite difficult to deal with from a prediction perspective because they are so radically different. We go from one situation very quickly into something else. Now, it's possible that the Southern Ocean will hit a tipping point and we will rapidly upwell all of that warm water and will melt the ice, and then the ice sheets will start melting, and we'll drain the ice sheets off the Antarctic continent. At the moment, it doesn't look as though we're getting towards it, but I wouldn't put a lot of confidence in that prediction.
Thank you, Ed, for answering those questions so capably, and to all the participants who submitted questions. Now, I know there are some participants whose questions weren't selected to be read out, but Ed is very happy to communicate further with you via Twitter, and his Twitter handle will be on the screen in a moment. I'd like to thank Ed very much for presenting this first webinar for the Royal Society of Tasmania for 2020. It's always a particular pleasure for the Royal Society when it's one of our own members presenting. And in Ed's case, it's particularly exciting because Ed joined us as a student member, and we're always very excited to have student members, and even more so when the student members stay with us into their professional careers. A lot of attendees today are members, and you will know that the mission statement of the Royal Society of Tasmania is the advancement of knowledge. So I think you'll all agree with me that today's lecture was in the very best of that tradition. So thank you, Ed, very much for such a fascinating talk.
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak to the Royal Society today, Mary. It's been an absolute pleasure.
And I'd like to invite you, Ed, to place the final slide on the screen. Thank you. So to all our participants, we're very happy that you could join us. We're extremely happy to have had participants from Tasmania, interstate and overseas. For people who may be new to the Royal Society of Tasmania, we have a website, rst.org.au, and we invite you to check out our website to see the events that are coming up and other things that you may participate in. If you would like to give feedback about this lecture, we'd be very happy to receive that. And the Royal Society email address is on the screen now. It's also on our website. If you would like to become a member of the Royal Society of Tasmania, membership is open to all people who have an interest in the advancement of knowledge. And I suspect that that's everyone who participated in today's lecture. So if you're not already a member, we'd be delighted to welcome you. So on our website, there's a membership application button. Please click on that. And after that, it's self-explanatory. Before closing, I would like to thank the Royal Society of Tasmania members who helped with the preparing and promoting of this webinar. We're delighted that our first webinar has been a success, that so many people have been able to take part in it. On the screen now, you can see Ed's Twitter handle, and he, as I mentioned before, he's very happy to communicate with you if your question was not selected to be read out today. So thank you very much, Ed, as our speaker. Thank you very much to all attendees, and I'll now close the meeting for everybody. Thank you very much for taking part.